Everyone has seen time travel or time loop films because they're great. I'm looking at you, Groundhog Day. But we all know they can't be real. Or can they? Well, this will keep you up at night. There are real cases, documented incidents, and mysterious events that suggest time travel might not be as impossible as we think. From stuff that happened to regular people, with witnesses and evidence, to freak documents in history that have absolutely zero logical explanations. Let's start with something that happened in 1935 in a small town outside of London. A woman named Margaret Thompson was walking to the local market when she suddenly found herself standing in the same street, but everything looked different. The buildings were newer, the cars were strange, and the people were dressed in clothes she'd never seen before. She wandered around for what felt like hours, completely confused and terrified, until she suddenly snapped back to her own time. Here's where it gets interesting. Margaret described seeing signs and advertisements for products that didn't exist in 1935. She talked about cars that looked nothing like the vehicles of her time, and she even described a peculiar building that she swore wasn't there before. The weird part, 20 years later, that exact building was constructed in the precise location she had described, and it looked exactly like what she had seen during her strange experience. But Margaret's story isn't unique. Throughout history, there have been dozens of similar cases where people claim to have slipped through time, only to return with knowledge they shouldn't have. The thing that makes these cases so disturbing isn't just the impossibility of it all, but the fact that many of these people were able to provide details about future events that later came true. Take the case of James Harrison, a factory worker from Detroit who disappeared for 3 days in 1962. When he returned, he was found wandering the streets, completely disoriented and talking about things that made no sense to anyone around him. He kept mentioning something called the internet, described devices that could fit in your pocket and connect you to people around the world, and talked about cars that could drive themselves. Now, you might think, okay, maybe this guy was just having some kind of breakdown or hallucination. But here's the thing that'll make your skin crawl. James drew detailed sketches of the devices he claimed to have seen. These sketches, which are now kept in a private collection, show remarkable similarities to modern smartphones, tablets, and even some features of autonomous vehicles that weren't developed until decades later. The investigators who worked on James's case were baffled. They conducted extensive psychological evaluations, checked his background for any exposure to science fiction, and even brought in experts to examine his sketches. None of them could explain how a factory worker with a high school education could have conceived of technologies that were so far beyond anything that existed in 1962. But the story gets even stranger. During his missing 3 days, multiple witnesses reported seeing James in places he couldn't possibly have been. A shopkeeper swore she saw him buying groceries on Tuesday morning while his own wife insisted he was missing. A police officer claimed he gave James directions on Wednesday afternoon, but according to the official timeline, James didn't return until Thursday evening. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of these time travel cases, the paradoxes they create. How can someone be seen in multiple places during the same time period? How can they return with knowledge of the future while simultaneously being observed in the present? These aren't just philosophical questions anymore, they're real scenarios that have left investigators scratching their heads for decades. Another case that'll make you question everything happened in 1970 in a small town in Oregon. A photographer named David Chen was taking pictures at a local festival when he noticed something odd in one of his shots. The photograph clearly showed a man in the background wearing clothes that were completely out of place for the time period. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that David recognized the man. It was his grandfather who had died in 1954. Not someone who looked like his grandfather, but actually his grandfather, down to a distinctive scar on his left hand and a unique pocket watch that David remembered from his childhood. The man in the photograph appeared to be the exact same age as when David's grandfather had died 16 years earlier. David took the photograph to experts, thinking it might be some kind of double exposure or camera malfunction. But every analysis came back the same. The photograph was genuine, with no signs of tampering or manipulation. Even more disturbing, when David showed the picture to other family members, they all immediately recognized his grandfather and pointed out details that only someone who had known him personally would notice. This case opened up a whole new category of time travel mysteries, people appearing in photographs from time periods they shouldn't exist in. And David's case isn't isolated. There are dozens of similar photographs from around the world, showing people in places and times where they simply cannot be. What makes these cases so disturbing isn't just their impossibility, but the emotional impact they have on the people involved. Imagine seeing a deceased loved one in a recent photograph, looking exactly as they did when they died years ago. Imagine the questions that would flood your mind, the desperate hope mixed with absolute terror. The psychological toll these cases take on witnesses is something that rarely gets discussed, but it's absolutely devastating. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychiatrist who's worked with several time travel witnesses, told me that these people often develop what she calls temporal anxiety disorder. They become obsessed with time, constantly checking clocks, afraid to go to sleep because they might wake up in a different era, terrified that they'll slip through time again without warning. One of her patients, a woman named Linda Rodriguez, experienced what might be the most terrifying time travel incident on record. In 1987, Linda was driving home from work when she took a wrong turn down a street she'd never seen before. The street looked normal enough, lined with houses that seemed to be from the 1950s, but something felt wrong. The air was different, heavier somehow, and there was an odd silence that made her skin crawl. As she drove slowly down the street, looking for a place to turn around, she noticed people in the yards and windows of the houses. They were all staring at her car with expressions of absolute horror, as if they were seeing some kind of monster. Children were running inside, adults were backing away, and Linda could swear she heard screaming coming from inside the houses. Here's where it gets really messed up. Linda's car was a 1985 Honda Civic, nothing special or unusual for the time. But to the people on that street, it might as well have been a spaceship. She realized that somehow she had driven into the past, and her modern car was terrifying people who had never seen anything like it. Linda panicked and floored the accelerator, desperate to get away from the staring faces and the screaming. She turned the corner at the end of the street and found herself back in familiar territory, in her own time. The whole experience had lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it left her so shaken that she didn't drive for 6 months afterward. The really disturbing part, Linda went back to that area dozens of times over the years, trying to find that street again. It doesn't exist. There's no street in that location that matches her description, and local historians confirmed that no neighborhood matching what she saw was ever built in that part of town. But wait, it gets worse. 3 years later, Linda was going through some old newspapers at the local library when she found something that made her blood run cold. There was a small article from 1953 about a ghostly automobile that had terrorized residents of a quiet neighborhood. The article described children running in fear from a demon car that had appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. The location described in the newspaper article, the exact same area where Linda had her experience 34 years later. This brings us to one of the most mind-bending aspects of these cases, the idea that time might not be linear at all, but rather some kind of loop or spiral where past and present can intersect in ways we don't understand. It's like time has weak spots, places where the barrier between different eras becomes thin enough for people to slip through. Dr. Marcus Webb, a theoretical physicist who studied these cases, has a theory that makes your brain hurt just thinking about it. He believes that certain locations might exist as what he calls temporal nexus points, places where multiple time periods overlap. According to his research, these nexus points often occur in areas with high electromagnetic activity or unusual geological formations. What's really unsettling is that Dr. Webb has identified several locations around the world where time travel incidents occur repeatedly. There's a stretch of highway in Nevada where dozens of drivers have reported similar experiences to Linda's. There's a forest in Germany where hikers regularly claim to encounter people from different time periods. And there's a building in New York City where tenants have been reporting temporal anomalies for over 50 years. The building in New York is particularly disturbing because it's still occupied. Residents have reported seeing previous tenants who died years ago, hearing sounds from decades past, and finding objects that belong to people who lived there in different eras. The building management keeps these reports quiet, but the documentation goes back to the 1960s. One tenant, Maria Santos, lived in apartment 4B from 1995 to 2003. During her time there, she regularly encountered a woman named Eleanor who claimed to be the original tenant of the apartment. Eleanor would appear in Maria's kitchen, cooking meals using ingredients and utensils that would disappear as soon as Eleanor vanished. The weird part? Maria researched the building's history and found that Eleanor Morrison had indeed lived in apartment 4B from 1952 until her death in 1961. Maria documented these encounters meticulously, taking photographs and keeping detailed journals. Some of the photographs show a translucent figure that matches descriptions of Eleanor from people who knew her in the 1950s. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Eleanor wasn't just appearing as a ghost or spirit. She was interacting with Maria's present, moving objects, leaving behind smells of cooking food, and even having conversations about current events as if she was somehow aware of both time periods simultaneously. These cases force us to confront the possibility that our understanding of death, life, and time itself might be completely wrong. If people can slip between different time periods, if the dead can interact with the living across decades, then what does that mean for everything we think we know about reality? The most recent case I investigated happened just 2 years ago in a small town in Montana. A teenager named Jake Morrison was walking home from school when he claims he stepped through what he describes as an invisible doorway and found himself in the same town, but in the year 1962. So there you have it. Margaret Thompson seeing buildings that wouldn't exist for decades. James Harrison sketching smartphones in 1962. David Chen photographing his dead grandfather at a festival. Linda Rodriguez driving into the 1950s and terrifying an entire neighborhood. Jake Morrison stepping through invisible doorways between time periods. These aren't just stories anymore, they're documented cases that challenge everything. We think we know about time, reality, and what's actually possible in this universe. Look, I get it. This stuff sounds absolutely insane. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. We have witnesses, we have evidence, we have documentation from multiple sources, and we have zero logical explanations. Science can't explain these cases, investigators can't solve them, and experts can't debunk them. They just exist, sitting there in police files and private collections, waiting for someone to figure out what the hell is actually going on. Maybe time isn't the straight line we think it is. Maybe there are cracks in reality that some people accidentally slip through. Maybe the past, present, and future are all happening simultaneously, and occasionally, someone gets a glimpse behind the curtain. Or maybe we're all just living in some kind of simulation where the code occasionally glitches. Either way, the next time you get that weird déjà vu feeling, or you swear you saw someone who shouldn't be there, or you find yourself somewhere you've never been before but somehow recognize, just remember these cases. Because if these stories have taught us anything, it's that reality is a lot stranger than we think. If you enjoyed this video, click the other video on the screen to see more.